said, no, you know the rules, we gotta fly in formation. And about 5 minutes more, some fighters come up and shot him down, and so just, but 4 guys bailed out that I remember, and I never know what happened.
What was the scariest thing you had to experience in the war?
Well, I don't know, there's scariest, I guess, and you have a little apprehension. Sometimes things were a little more difficult than others. I guess my recollection is when we were flying there, we had to sometimes go in the Bombay area. The plane carried bombs in it was like a section, you know, it was about 12 feet long and about 8 feet wide, and that's where they had the bombs on each side of there, and across that thing was a little catwalk about 12 inches wide, and they had they had ropes on each side to walk across that thing. When the plane was flying, the doors were closed, and it was all right. But when we were over the targets, we had to open the doors, and you could look down and out, and you look down anywhere from 30 to 60,000 feet above the earth, and that was kind of scary if you're out in that Bombay area. And one time, sometimes a bomb or something, you'd have a problem, you'd have to go out there, and that was very scary to go on, hold on to these ropes and get out there and release some bomb or something happened out there. And that's just, you know, with the wind going and the cold, and you had to put on your parachute on your chest. You had chest parachute, and that was kind of bulky, and you're out there trying to maneuver around, and these ropes were kind of like a theater rope that they keep in line, and they were kind of like that, and they were kind of shaking around, and you had to work out there, and you'd been out there a couple minutes seemed like an hour.
Yeah. Was there a minimum number of times you had to complete missions?
Well, in our theater operation, we were in the 15th Air Force, and we had to complete 50 missions. Each area, like the ones in England, the 8th Air Force, they deemed that they flew 25, and in the Pacific, the Air Force decided on the complexity and the length of the mission, and what it was that the combat crews could really sustain, you know, and operate efficiently under a certain amount of time here, that a certain amount of stress is built up among the people, and they can operate effectively, and that's how they determine the thing, how long they should stay. Now, some of the fellows on the ground, the infantry and some of those people would be up on the lines. I knew some guys were up on the lines in Italy for 45 days, and they didn't take their boots off for 45 days. And they're sleeping out there with 2 blankets and eating coffee in their helmet out there and living out there. And those fellows had one heck of a time. But the thing is, they were trained for that. And you know, you got trained, and they generally would let them go and operate in the limits that they were trained for. Sometime unusual situations come up that they were trapped there, they had to do there, and they had to stay for longer times and be under severe stress for a different amount of time.
How many planes were in a formation?
Well, each group, at least in our group, we were required to put up 28 planes a day. And we flew every day, Saturday, Sunday, Easter, any day the weather was good, that we could take off, and at the target area that they had planned for that day was visible. And that was their assignment. Now, in the other areas, I don't know, but that's what we were allowed. And when the planes came back at night, the mechanics and them had to work on them to make sure that they had them ready for the next day. And some of those guys worked all night and were there to do that. And that was the requirement, and most of the time they met it. When we went overseas, we flew in a plane by ourselves, and we went from Florida to Belém, Brazil, and then we flew across the Atlantic into Africa down there, and then we went up into Italy and Sicily. And see, these crews kept coming over all the time bringing planes, and that was to replace the ones that were shot down or lost. And then finally they had a number of planes over there that they kept bringing them over all the time.
Where was the place you said that you flew over and your hands and your feet were so cold that you still like lose some feeling in them now today?
I don't remember the place, but near the end of my missions, my heated suit went out, and we wore a heated suit and gloves and boots, and they had heated shoes and heated gloves, and I don't know, something happened to my suit, and my hands and feet were really cold, and they didn't just didn't operate that day, and it was really cold down there. And I don't know, it was about 45 below zero, and it was out there for about 5 or 6 hours there in that time, and my hands kind of always bothered me thinking they got some secondary frostbite during that time. And that's just kind of like a equipment malfunction, and then you got a problem. And but I mean, it didn't. It bothered me a little bit, but I had about 10 missions to go, and I was going to determine to just go on and not worry about it to get my 50 missions in so I could go home.
How did your family feel about you being in the planes during the war? Were they supportive?
My family was very supportive, and they prayed for me like they prayed for I had a brother in the Pacific. He was in the Army Engineers, and they prayed for us, and I guess my father kind of worried. Sometimes they would see in the paper, like one time 70 planes were lost over Berlin, and he kind of related that to my situation, you know, and they would hear about these things that they reported so many planes were lost, and they would think, is that my boy or something like that, and I guess they were kind of apprehensive. We couldn't call, there was no phones or anything like that, and we could only communicate with our parents via mail. And we would, you know, get mail every 2 or 3 weeks and things like that.
So, were you in college before you went to the war, or during, or how did that work?
I was in Xavier University, and I was in my sophomore year, and we, Jack Meiners and my best friend, we were just coming to 21, and we knew we were going to have to go into service, and I didn't want to go in the Army or the Navy, and I thought I'd rather go in the Air Force, so we enlisted in the Air Force.
Mm-hmm. After you were done being in the war, did anything change? Did your life change a lot, or?
Well, I mean, I guess you had a little broader perspective of things after the war, because you'd been around the different places, and it was a lot of interesting cities and towns and various countries here. And I guess the biggest change I saw is the people were willing to move and relocate and change, and I think that President Eisenhower opened up the country by building the highway system. They had the interstate highway was developed under him, and for a number, 8 to 10 years, they built all of these places here, and the country moved. People, was nothing to go to Chicago for a day or two or things like that, and people never did that thing. They traveled around, and a lot of people and servicemen were in other areas, different parts of the country, California and different places, and they liked it there, and they said, well, I'll maybe move there, or they met people there and were married, and families moved around. And I think the opening up of with the highway system, and then the coming of the development of the commercial aviation, which really blossomed, and they got a lot of pilots from the Air Force and the Navy to fly the commercial planes. Those things really changed the country and made the country really grow and prosper.
While you were in the war, didn't you get to meet the man with stigmata? Can you tell me about that?
I guess you're referring to Padre Pio.
Yeah.
And yes, I met Padre Pio in the spring of 1944. It was the week after Easter. We were assigned stationed at Foggia, Italy. That's an area they build air bases down there. It was just fields down there, about 70 miles below Rome. And Father Pio was in a monastery, I think about 20 miles from there. And the chaplain's assistant mentions one Sunday that he was going up there. We flew every day. The weather was good, but on that Sunday I didn't have to fly, so I went up there with a number of 6 other fellas, I think 5 other people, and we drove up in the back of an army truck, and we got there right about Mass time, around 9, I think it was 9 o'clock, and it was a little kind of a little church, kind of a flat buildings on the top of the left side of a hill up there. And we drove up there, and we got there just as the Mass was about to start. And side, they didn't have pews. They had chairs, benches. And the chairs, a lot of them were like kitchen chairs. They were green and red, painted, and yellow. And I think, I may be wrong, but I think these were the people's, like, people used to own pews or rent pews at the church, and that was their place to sit. They brought these things, and that's where they sat at the Mass. And it was kind of somewhat crowded, and the usher took this other fella and I up into the sanctuary, and he gave us a folding chair to sit on, and we knelt on the terrazzo floor up there. And I was on the gospel side of the altar, about 8 or 10 feet from Father Pio, and I could look up there, him watching the Mass. And the Mass was in Latin, and I was a server for years, and I could understand the thing. There was no homily, and it was just kind of an ordinary Mass until it got to the consecration. And at that point, the Father stood there, and he held his hands, and he looked up like that, and he just stood there and didn't move, didn't blink his eyes, and he just stood there. And I thought he stood there for, I don't know, it seemed to